The Dreamcast was certainly a system that is held fondly by plenty of people, including myself. There was a kind of magic around that time, with so many games with unusual concepts that turned out to be some beloved titles over time, like Space Channel 5, Res, Crazy Taxi, and 22 Rocket. A lot of these games even made quite an impact towards the industry and inspired future developers like Shenmue that broke ground when it was released with its open world-like structure, and Phantasy Star Online being one of the first console games with online multiplayer. One of these games that is still talked about today from a good chunk of dedicated followers and has inspired many developers like Sunset Overdrive and Bomb Rush Cyberpunk is
Jet Set Radio!
Jet Set Radio, or to Americans who played it back at the start of the century, Jet Grind Radio, was released on the Sega Dreamcast, developed by Smilebit, who were known for the Panzer Dragoon series and many Sega sports titles, and a lot of the devs are now part of the team who makes the Yakuza titles. The concept of Jet Set Radio started with the lead artist, Ryuta Uda, drawing various artworks around Panzer Dragoon Saga's development, and after the director of Jet Set Radio, Masayoshi Takeuchi, is there any way we can make a game where these characters are in it? And Takeuchi was impressed with these sketches that they decided to go to the higher ups at Sega, who at the time were a bit more open, letting the younger staff work on newer games. The majority of the team were quite young, especially Takeuchi, who was inexperienced at the time, Yiden, being the first time he directed a game. The development of Jet Set Radio was pretty tough due to many of the younger staff and a lack of programmers that could come in during the planning phase. This was at the time when they had the concepts, characters and ideas for Jet Set Radio, but they didn't have a concrete idea of what the game was going to be. They initially thought of doing an adventure or an RPG game before setting on the Staten and Graffiti arcade style gameplay, especially since Staten was popular during the time. There were two goals that Uda and Takeuchi wanted from the beginning. The first was to incorporate motifs not found in traditional games, things that the younger generation would find cool, and the setting was making 3D environments for new ways to play. A lot of the game was inspired by youth culture in Japan at the time, like the fashion and the music, and the locations were inspired by the cities of Japan and America. The team targeted the Japanese audience, however Jet Set Radio did a lot better in the western side of the globe. I played a lot of my older brother's Dreamcast as a kid, but Jet Set Radio wasn't amongst the games I played on the system. It wasn't until around 2010 where I bought my own Dreamcast with Jet Set Radio, Shenmue 1 and 2, and Stars of Arcadia. It was one of those games I played quite a bit during my university days. The version I played for this review though is the HD version that came out in 2012 for Xbox Live, PSN, and Steam. There was also an iPhone and Android port, but that was taken down a couple of years after its release. Now, let's see what made it so funky.
Let's get scratching.
The game is set in the fictional city known as Tokyo, but everyone just calls it Tokyo, where at the beginning you form a group of skaters known as the GGs, who love to skate and graffiti across the city. In the first part of the game, you try to claim turf against rival gang members, the Love Suckers, Noise Tanks, and Poison Jam. Once you take down each rival gang, they will drop a piece of a metal disc which seems to have the power to summon a demon. An organization known as the Golden Rhino, which is run by the giant conglomerate, the Rikaka Group, are looking for these pieces to use the demon's powers to rule the world. The bad guys manage to steal the pieces from the GGs, but the GGs eventually confront their leader, Doji Rikaku, in a final showdown and spray his bald head where he dies from embarrassment. I like the final reveal that the demonic record just turns out to be a hoax, being an obscure indie record. I enjoyed the way the story is told through the pirate radio station, Jet Set Radio, run by the charismatic loudmouth Professor K. This dude right here is so darn memorable, like the way he shouts the name of the game at the title screen, to his bad advice of dead and rhythm roaches.
Jet Set Radio! Let's go to the mailbag. A letter from Mr. Osaki asks, how do I get rid of these nasty roaches? Easy, just burn your house down!
It's a shame you can't play as him, but the rest of the cast have a lot of style and personality, from the poster boy Beat, the poster girl Gum, the number 3 Tab, and the rest. My favourite is probably either Gum or Piranha, just for the visual design alone. Some of the scenes are also told through another character's perspective, Combo, who hails from Grind City, along with Cube, and explains what the Golden Rhinos are after and why they flew to Tokyo to join the Yeezys. It kind of feels like Combo is one of the main characters in the story, but the Grind City segment was only included in the international and later Japanese versions of the game. Even if you haven't played Jet Set Radio, you may have heard at least a couple of tracks from the game, either in the Sega crossovers or from the Family Guy Hideki Nakamura, known for his work on games like the Sonic Rush series, the upcoming Bomb vs. Cyberpunk, and of course this game, which is a banger. I had to admit I didn't care for his work on Sonic Rush back in the day, but after hearing the tracks here, I realised my past self probably didn't have good taste. Nakamura basically used samplers and combined them into meaningless words and turned them into tracks that you can listen to. There are a variety of genres, such as hip-hop, J-pop, metal, rock, dance, electronica, and acid jazz trip-hop, and were inspired by music around the time of its release. Other musicians include Vincent Zark, Tomonori Sadawada, David Soul, BB Rights, Idol Taxi, Tatar Vader, Jurassic 5, and even Rob Zombie. Some of the songs that Vincent Zark, Tomonori Sadawada, and Nakamura's work are original to the game, but a lot of these tracks are actually licensed. Each region even had their own exclusive song, while removing others like the US had Gladiator by Rob Zombie, while the PAL version had Many Styles by Obi-Wan. The re-release version includes most of the songs from each region, barring a few. I imagine these songs are being listened to on the pirate radio station by the characters while stating around. The soundtrack for this game is perhaps in my top 10 of all time, as I listen to it on occasion. In the HD version, you can listen to a couple of tracks from Future. Unfortunately, you cannot listen to the Future tracks during gameplay. That's just a tease. One of the things that makes this game stand out from a lot of games in the era it came out is its distinct cel-shaded art style, being one of the first to use this technique in video games. Cel-shaded is a style of rendering that makes 3D objects to appear like a comic book or hand-drawn animations by replacing the conventional shading with flat colors and shadows. The use of cel-shading gives Jet Set Radio like an interactive street art or an interactive music album that was released in the 90s to early 2000s era. While the background NPCs certainly shows this game was made on a Dreamcast, the visuals still hold up incredibly well, especially the HD port that is full of colour and charm. I love Ryuta Uda's character designs and how well it translated into a 3D environment. A lot of the character designs are based on the Harajuku street fashion that was popular amongst teens and youngsters in Japan, with the outlandish bright coloured clothes to display the freedom of expression, which perfectly captures the essence of this game. American hip-hop culture around this time period was also an inspiration for some of the designs. Each area is inspired by the streets of Tokyo and America, and each city is vibrant, colourful, and distinct from each other. There are 5 areas: Shibuya-to, which is supposed to mimic Shibuya, Benten-to, a nighttime district filled with a subway station and populated streets, and Tukado-to is a suburban district where you traverse through the sewers. The international versions included 2 locations located in Grind City that were inspired by locations in America, from the suburban street of Queens to the Times Square area. I liked how its art style is not just for show and is perfectly implemented into the game with its graffiti mechanic. The developers got plenty of graffiti artists to commission a set of graffiti into the game, including Eric Hayes, who apparently helped design the title logo and made album art for the Beastie Boys and Public Enemy. Sega even held 2 contests for both the International Dreamcast release and the digital re-release. The winners of the digital re-release even got their art into the game, which is super cool, seeing the interaction between the game makers and fans. The Dreamcast had online functionality, and in that version, you could create and sell your own art online and use them in-game instead of the already made ones. The online functionality doesn't work anymore on the Dreamcast version, and the 7 artworks weren't in the re-release, but the trading part was still intact. It would have been so awesome if the game was supported with a graphics tablet, or if it got a Wii U or 3DS port using the stylus. We've talked about a lot of the narrative and presentation, but the vital part of the game is the gameplay, so let's talk about it. The goal for the majority of the story missions is to spray a certain amount of graffiti in areas marked with red arrows within a time limit. The beginning of each stage usually starts off straightforward, but once you turn a couple of areas, the insanity can ramp up to 11, with your enforcers and others coming to take you down with batons, guns, tear gas, helicopters, and tanks, and even goes more insane later on. And for what? Just for some harmless vandalism? The Your Enforcers aren't much of an issue in the first half of the game, but in later levels, these dudes can be annoying when you are in the middle of spraying. The people with the jetpacks in the sewers are the worst. I normally just brute force my way through. There are optional levels where there are no cops after you if you want to play without the hassle. There are 3 different sizes of graffiti which certain areas require you to spray. You have the small sizes that only need 1 press of the trigger, and then you have the medium and large ones that need to be done in consecutive rhythmic events. When in graffiti mode, you have to move the analog stick to mirror the actions on screen, which works well. You don't have an infinite supply of spray cans though. You have to get a bunch of spray cans in order to spray on the walls. The game has 5 districts for you to traverse, which may not be a whole lot, but these 5 areas are quite large in scope, with multiple sections in each. This may seem daunting at first, but the game gradually eases you in by having the first missions in each district yacht into one area, and then the next mission leads you to another location until you can explore the entire district, and by then you may have already learned where everything is. I like playing each district, except for the Times Square area, where it's basically one entire vertical area. There's a pain every time you fall down, as getting back up is tedious. I played through the campaign numerous times over the last 4 months, and I realised that while you can spray any walls in any order, some routes are better to do first. For example, in the final Tocado level, you had the jetpack dudes that would come in at some point. I usually just sprayed the street area first, but once I got into the sewers, I had trouble against the jetpack dudes who kept gunning me down. But in a recent playthrough, I went to the sewers first and had much of an easier time because these dudes don't spawn straight away. It felt so good to find the most optional route. A lot of Sega games like Sonic and Super Monkey Ball are all about replayability and finding new ways to play, and Jet Set Radio follows that model too, with the scoring system, accessible yet in-depth level designs, plenty of unlockables, and playing as quickly as possible. Throughout the campaign, you are able to recruit new members. Some of them will join if you can mirror their moves in a couple of chances, which is a good way to teach you the various tricks and maneuvers you can perform, like the wall jumps and grinds, and some will ask you to race them and tag a specific spot, which can be annoying, especially with how the game controls. I usually hate going up against Beat as combo, where I make one mistake that causes me to fail and restart. The controls can take some time to get used to, especially if you're playing on the Dreamcast that only has the one analog stick. In the Dreamcast version, you couldn't freely rotate the camera. Instead, you can only reset the camera that snaps back behind the player counter using the L trigger, and the problem there is that the L trigger is also tied to the sprite action, which isn't much of a problem in the majority of the game, but there are a few missions where you go up against the rival gang members where you have to spray their backs, and sometimes instead of spraying behind them, the camera angle changes. These rival missions can be done within seconds, or can be a while as each rival gang has a similar speed to you, and if you bump into something, it can take a while for you to catch up to them due to your acceleration speed. Thankfully, the developers of the HD port Bitworks added a camera you can rotate using the right analog stick, but the way to reset the camera is still tied to the spray action. It's weird, especially since 2 of the 4 face buttons aren't really used. The stages feel a bit heavier than I would expect, making platforming, especially in more vertical spaces, a bit awkward. Like the classic Sonic games, the stages start off slow and take a bit to go fast, but unlike the classic Sonic games, it takes a while for them to pick up speed. Stuff like wall jumping and grinding increases the stage's momentum, and pulling off scripts is satisfying. I think the grinding ability was an inspiration from the grinding in Sonic Adventure 2, but I think the execution is handled better in Jet Set, as the players magnetically attach themselves to the object when grinding. The controls aren't terrible, but it kinda just knocks down from being a fantastic game to a good one. Besides the story levels, there are the races, which play 1-to-1 to the rival races, as well as a story cap mode, similar to many extreme sports games. Despite some issues, I still think Jet Set Radio is a blast to play, especially today. Sega games, especially during the 90s and early 2000s, had a lot of charm, and Jet Set Radio is a prime example of being a game that stands out with its stylized visuals, its funky beats, and wacky scenarios. While it wasn't a huge success when it came out, it impacted a lot of games in the future, being the forefront of the cel-shade technique used in games such as The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. Indie developers have also taken a shot to recreate the magic of this gem with games such as Hover and Team Reptile's upcoming game Bomb Rush Cyberpunk. The games also have a dedicated fan base. I would like to shout out to JSR Archives, who want to archive all things Jet Set Radio, and DJ Professor K, who made their own online radio station inspired by the fictional pirate radio station. Besides the re-release in 2012, there was a sequel titled Jet Set Radio Future that had more of a sandbox structure rather than an arcade mission-based gameplay, and apparently improved a lot of the issues from the original. Unfortunately, Future is only available on the OG Xbox, and unlike some Xbox games that are backward compatible, such as Panzer and ORTA, Future has remained in OG Xbox prison. I would love to talk about Future more in the future, but unfortunately I don't have an original Xbox. I would love it if Sega would re-release this game onto modern systems similar to its predecessor. The original game is thankfully accessible as it's on most digital stores, and it's pretty cheap too, so if you haven't played Jet Set Radio, then what are you waiting for? I would love to see the GGs come back with a new installment.